Hey everybody, Andrew Hogue here, your security, privacy, and forensics expert with a technical walkthrough on how to build an iOS app using GitHub Actions. Even though there are a number of mobile-specific CI/CD tools out there, I really prefer GitHub Actions for a number of reasons. First of all, my source code already exists there, so I don't have to send it anywhere else. Second of all, everything about my CI/CD process is not only part of that repo, but it's source controlled. Also, I spend a lot of time on GitHub and they have a great developer experience, so I'm just comfortable with that environment. And then lastly, the GitHub Marketplace has thousands and thousands of actions that you can reuse, but the best part is it's open source. So you can actually go out there, check out the code, see how they're implemented, and then incorporate that or the code itself into your CI/CD process. So let's dive right in. I'm actually fairly new to iOS development, and if you are as well, there's a couple of posts that I've done in the past that you could take a look at to get everything ready. Everything that I talk about here today is on my personal website, don't panic, so just go out to andrewhogue.com, click blog, or you could also use the search to find what you're looking for. The first thing you want to do is make sure that you have Xcode installed, and so I have a number of different ways you can do that with this particular post. And then you're going to want to download my sample application, or an application that you'd like to test. And then you're actually going to want to build an iOS app in Xcode. In this particular post, I'll walk you through how to do that with the I Am Groot app that I built as kind of a Hello World app. And then the last post will walk you through how to build that iOS app archive using the command line on your Mac computer. If you follow those steps, you'll have all the files that you need to automate this in a GitHub action. And so I really recommend going down that path. There are 4 general steps that we're going to follow. First of all, you'll make sure that your code is set up, and hopefully you've got the tool chain up and running like I just mentioned. Second of all, we'll get the different configuration inputs that we need for the GitHub action. Then we'll create the corresponding repository secrets so we can securely access that information from our GitHub action. And then lastly, we'll create the GitHub action workflow. Now, if you're using your own application, you can go ahead and skip the code setup part. Otherwise, take a look at my previous post, and I'll link it in the description as well, and that'll walk you through downloading my sample application and getting it set up on your computer. So next, we're going to get the configuration inputs that we need together, and there's 4 of them. First of all, we need the signing certificate so that the build process can sign your application and you can deploy that. You'll also need a strong passcode with that because that's a really important piece of information, and you don't want a certificate out there that anybody else could maybe stumble upon and then reuse to impersonate you. The next thing that you'll need is the mobile provisioning profile. That contains information about your different entitlements and your team ID. All of these are required for Xcode build command line tools. The next thing that you'll need to do is create a password for the build machine. Anytime you kick off a GitHub action, an ephemeral runner is created, and so you have to do any initialization of that operating system from scratch. In order to use the signing certificate and provisioning profiles, they need to be stored in the keychain, and that requires a password. So we'll go ahead and create that. And then lastly, to export this to an IPA, we'll need the ExportOptions.plist. This can be really helpful if you want to push the app to different devices, or maybe upload it to a third-party scanning service that needs the IPA. It's also a key step that you would do to prepare to push the app out to the Apple App Store. Now, if you want to do these things manually, there are plenty of blogs out there. I've linked to several of them, and they'll walk you through the different steps of downloading the certificates from the developer website at Apple or creating the plist files manually. But I'm lazy, and because Xcode already created all of these files for me, I want to just reuse what I have on my system and get this up and running as fast as possible. So I'm going to jump between this post and a terminal, and if you want to follow along exactly the way that I do this, just copy these commands and everything should work. So the first thing that we're going to do is create a directory in our home directory called SPF Expert, and then I've created this iOS-deploy, just a place to store all of our files. So if that doesn't exist, it will create it, and then we'll change into that particular directory. So right now we've got an empty directory. Next, we're going to export the signing certificate, and in order to do this, you need to run an application called Keychain Access. So if you don't know where that is, you can just do a spotlight search by doing Command Spacebar, type in Keychain Access, hit Enter, and then make sure you've clicked on Log On and then My Certificates. Now, if you don't have any certificates here, it means that you haven't actually kicked off the build process already on your machine, And again, I'd highly recommend you go do that, or alternatively, you can create these things on the Apple developer website and download it to your local workstation. But in this particular instance, I have two different certificates. This was actually a problem for me. I didn't know which one to use, and I'll show you a tip in a minute on how you can figure that out yourself. But after a little trial and error, I figured out which one. So it's going to be this top one. You just click on the certificate, click Export, and then choose where you want to save that. Make sure that you're saving it into the iOS deploy directory that we created in your home directory. And then I'm just going to stick with the default file name of certificates.p12. Now that's actually going to prompt you for a password. So as I mentioned on the blog, there's actually an application that I really like called Password Store. And I'm just going to, can't really see the command here, sorry. I'm going to use Password Store to take a password that I already created. And then I'm going to go and copy that to my clipboard. And I'm just going to paste this in here. So that's going to create the password. And then you have to actually type in your system password. Okay, once you do that, it's going to go ahead and create the file for you. And this will be, again, a password encrypted certificate. Now, as I mentioned, there's a tip that I have about how I figured out which certificate to use. And I was doing a bit of trial and error, and I kept getting a certificate error or a provisioning profile error. So I went ahead and built the app command line on my workstation. And in the output from the build process, there's a code sign section. And in the code sign section, you can actually see the signing identity. So this is the one that starts with ZJN for me, and the provisioning profile. And once I had that information, I knew exactly what I needed to use. So back in the terminal, the next thing that we need is our mobile provisioning profile. And as you saw from the previous screen, that actually exists on the system. We know exactly where it is. So Apple stores these in a directory in your home directory called Library, Mobile Device, Mobile Provisioning Profiles. And if you take a look at that, you can see I've got a couple of provisioning profiles in here. And the one beginning with 1D0 is the one that we want. So let's go ahead and copy 1D0 into our working directory here. So now I've got the certificate and I've got the provisioning profile. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to need a password so that we can create a keychain on our macOS runner. And I touched on the pass command just a minute ago. Let me show you briefly how that works. So you can install this with Brew or download it directly from their website. It also works on Linux and other systems. But I'm actually going to go create a new password. And I'm going to generate an 18-digit password. And I have this kind of scratch space that I use under just temp. And so I'm going to say, go create an 18-digit password for me. Go ahead and overwrite the value because I don't really care about this value. And it'll generate it for me right down here. You can see this password. And as I showed you earlier, you can then just come out and say pass -c temp, and then that'll copy to the clipboard. So that just makes it really convenient to do things command line. All this uses GPG to encrypt the data, and you can actually store all of this in a Git repo so you can have password history as needed. So we'll go ahead and use that as our temporary password. And then the last thing that we need is the ExportOptions.plist. So let me go ahead and clear my directory here. And again, that's going to help you go from an X archive into an IPA file. And if you've built the app command line before, it actually already exists for you in the build directory. So since we've done that, I'm going to go ahead and copy that. So for me, that exists in the imgroup directory in a build directory that I created, and it's just called ExportOptions.plist. And again, I'm going to go ahead and copy that here. So now we have the different configuration inputs that we need, and now we're ready to go ahead and create our repository secrets. Now the way that this works is you're going to go out to your repository, wherever that might be, and then you're going to click on Settings, Secrets and Variables, and then we want to do this for GitHub Actions. And you can see I already have a number of these set up, so I don't want to go through and reconfigure all of them for you, but let's just do one of them real quick. So let's assume our keychain password is something that we want to get rid of and recreate. Okay, let's pop back over to our terminal. Let's go ahead and copy our password into our clipboard for 45 seconds. And then I'm going to create a new repository secret called keychain password. I'm going to go ahead and paste that in there. Now, when you're doing this for the other values, they're actually binary values, and you can't just paste them into that text box. So what we're going to do instead is use something called base64 encoding. And what that does is it takes the binary data and it serializes it into ASCII data that you can then copy into text boxes and more easily transmit and store. And the way that that works is you just use the base64 command, tell it what file you want. In this particular instance, let's do the mobile provisioning profile. And then you can pass it through PB copy. That'll copy it directly to your clipboard, so it makes it really easy to then just paste in as a secret. Before I do that, let me just show you what this looks like. So here, there's a normal file that would be an XML.plist file, and now we've encoded it into base64 format. So let's just put that into PB copy, and then I'll come back over and show you how that works. I'm not going to actually create this secret, so you'd put in your secret name. In this instance, it would be build_provision_profile_base64, and then you can literally just paste it in here directly. So make sure you go through and set up all 5 of these different secrets as repository secrets, and then we'll be ready to go on to building the actual GitHub workflow. Now, this was the part that was really overwhelming for me at first, and then I stumbled across this really fantastic document from GitHub where they talk about how to install Apple certificates on a macOS runner for Xcode development. And so you can literally kind of follow along here. They even put in a sample YAML file, and when you follow that, everything basically just works, and then you can paste in the rest of your code to build your application. So let me go ahead and take you through that real quick. I'm going to copy these commands. I'm going to clear my screen here. Let me just take you through this real quick. So I'm going to change it to my source code directory, and I'm going to create a GitHub workflow directory if it doesn't exist. And then I'm going to go ahead and create an empty file called build iOS app spfexport.yaml. Now, if that file exists, it actually won't overwrite it. So actually, it probably does exist for me. So let's come into GitHub workflows. Let's take a look. So yep, this file already exists because I had committed it to my repo. Let me just act like it doesn't exist, and we just created an empty version. Okay. So now we have a 0K file, and you can just go to this block of code, hit the copy button, and then use whatever editor of choice that you like. I'm going to be using NVim here. I'm going to go ahead and insert and paste this in directly. Now I'm going to walk you through this file in just a second. I'm going to go ahead and save it real quick. Now, if you're new to this and you've never created this file before, you actually need to commit that to your repo. So actually, to show that off, I'm going to make one slight change here, and I will add in an extra comment just so that there's something different about it. Okay. So what you would do in your directory is you'd look at git status, and you'd see that there's been a file that's either new or has been modified. If the file is new, you would do git add, and then you'd give it the file name here. But again, I've already added it, so it's not new. And then you would do a git commit, and we're going to commit this file, and then you can give it some sort of commit message, added comment. Okay, now that's cached here locally, and then I'm going to go ahead and do a git push. So that's going to push it up to my repo, and then create the actual GitHub Action workflow for you. Now, before we jump in there, let's go ahead and take a look at the file one more time and kind of walk through how that works. So we've got this particular workflow called build iOS app. There's different triggers that you can use. There's tons of them. I'm just using workflow dispatch because that's an easy way to do debugging and testing, and basically it allows you to do it manually. I put a link out here to another blog that I wrote up that will walk you through the different workflow options and link you out to the GitHub documentation around it. And I'm just going to focus right now on main. Now we create a job, and in that job we're going to have multiple steps, and we indicate that we want to run that on the latest version of macOS. Now the first thing that I did when I ran this is I actually wanted to see what version of Xcode was running. So I threw a step in here that runs Xcode build with -version. And when you look at the output there, they actually link to this page in their documentation. So all of the tools that are installed on the macOS runner, including their versions, is actually available for you in advance, and you don't actually have to do this debug stuff here. The next thing that we want to do is check out our repository. So we've got it on the runner itself. And then we're going to follow the steps from the GitHub documentation about installing the certificates and provisioning profiles on the runner itself. So here you can see that we're going to read those values out of our secrets. We're then going to use that to create a path for each of these files. So we're actually going to then echo out the contents of the environment variables. We're going to pipe that to base64 decode, and then we're going to store that in the path, and then we're going to store that in the file paths above. Once you have those in place, we actually have to create the keychain as we mentioned earlier. So you can see here we're creating a keychain, pushing the passwords and certificates, and then actually setting up the provisioning profile itself. Now that's all kind of standard, and then you want to get into building the actual application yourself. Again, if you're using my sample I am Groot application, everything here will just work. Otherwise, you need to make sure you do things like change your scheme and your different configurations that you want to use. But basically, we're going to build the archive, and then we're going to export the IPA. And then lastly, we're actually going to upload the application and store it as an artifact like I've done in other tutorials. And so that means that we'll have this accessible to us both through the web interface as well as through the REST API from GitHub. And we're going to go ahead and store the IPA, but you could also choose to store the entire directory itself so you have all the different build artifacts. Okay, let's pop back over now and take a look at the repo itself. So I'm going to come back in here, and you're going to go and click on Actions, and then here you'll click on the Build iOS application. And I'm going to go ahead and kick off a build real quick. So here you just go to Run Workflow, and that's going to start a build. Now, you could come in here and actually see your workflow file, everything that we just put in there. And if you want, you can even click E to edit that and make changes here, and then start a commit from the web UI, so that you don't have to go out and do all of that command line and then push it up to the repo from your workstation. But here you can see now we've got an iOS build that's kicked off. And if you click on that, you'll actually get live updating on where things are at. So you can see the different steps that it's taking. As I mentioned, there's an Xcode version command that I ran that actually ended up being extraneous because we already have a lot of information out there from GitHub on what is on those systems. And then all this debug information is going to fly by, and you can check the status of each of these builds and know exactly what's happened. Now let's go ahead and come back and just take a look at a job that's already run. For me, because this is a really simple app, it only takes a couple of minutes. But I ran this one earlier. You'll see all of the steps and debug is located here if you want to click on that. We had a successful build. And then as I mentioned, we have the artifacts file. So you can then just literally click this, and it will download it to your local workstation, and you'll have the IPA file available to you. Or alternatively, you can do that through the REST API. And I actually put a link out there that walks you through the steps on how to download it through the REST API. I also ran into a common issue where I would try to build it, and it would basically say there are no profiles for I am Groot, and that it couldn't find any development provisioning profiles, or I would get various certificate errors. And what I found was I was just not using the right certificates and the right provisioning profiles, but I put that out there in case folks are running into the same problem themselves. Okay, that's it. It seemed really difficult, but actually once you've already built the application on Xcode on your workstation, especially if you've done a command line, you really have all the properties that you need to just quickly convert that over to a GitHub action and then automatically build your application. You can kick off unit tests, security and privacy testing, push the app out to different testers, and a whole bunch of other things. So this will save you tons of time, and it's really great to just be able to incorporate all of this directly into the developer experience that you're already having out at GitHub. So I hope you found this useful. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time.